in downtown Tulsa really wouldn't be occurring. Woody is the cornerstone of everything that's happening down here. He is a community builder, and he is certainly building our community, and we couldn't be more grateful to what Nora has done and for her vision in bringing Woody back home. So I'll let her speak for herself. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nora Guthrie.
When you go out there, tell David Amram to get back in
I will
here.
tell.
It's a Guthrie thing too.
It's a little bit of a Guthrie thing, but growing up with all of these people like David Amram and Woody and Pete, Jack Elliott, they're great storytellers. They tend to ramble, which we love. And so my adolescent, rebellious thing to do was to start on time. and end on time. So anyway, I have a few thoughts I just wanted to share with you. I don't know if Joy is still around someplace, but in doing their presentation, and she talks about the ancestors have called us here, there's a number of things that crossed my mind. Many of you are sitting in seats that are designated to many of our ancestors. If you look behind you and see the seat you're sitting in, the first row of the theater is dedicated to Woody and his closest peers, Cisco Houston, Leadbelly, Sonny Terry, and Brownie McGee. They all have seats in this theater. The second row is the next generation of Ramblin' Jack Elliott, the family, his wives, people like that. The third row, we get to Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan, some other people who've carried on the legacy. So I thought it was very beautiful the way Joy was talking about the ancestors have called us here, and you're really, many of you are sitting in their seats and occupying their place in the world. So it might be interesting and fun for you later on to check out whose seat you're sitting in and therefore what your job might be. There might be some connection there. The second thought I had was when David was playing the Chinese instrument in Singapore and tying that all together, I couldn't help but think of Arlo's joke about this land is your land, from California to the New York Island. My mother was invited to China when the Nixon opened the door to trade. And my mother was one of the few people that was invited to go to China. And she came back and she was telling us how wonderful it was. She was doing Tai Chi in Tiananmen Square with everybody, and, just wonderful stories. And she said, and then I went to the school and all the children there sing This Land Is Your Land. And Arlo's like, why? Why are they singing This Land? And my mother was, she kind of looked at Arlo and kind of said, patted him on the head, oh, Arlo, you don't get it. And we kind of all went scratching our heads, still not getting it. And he realized a few years ago that the reason is because California to the New York Island goes around the other way. Goes through China. So we've picked up a lot of instruments and stories along the way as This Land Is Your Land has taken a trip around the world. The third thought I had is, of course, today is April. The climate change marches are happening in Washington. So as we are sitting, we're not marching, but I dedicate our sitting today to be with those people who are marching around. We have our work cut out for us even as we sit here. So this was kind of booked as a conversation with Nora because there's always so many things happening. There's so many scholars in the room. There's so many smart people in the room. And when you're just a family member, a daughter, you have some stories, but they're not always accurate sometimes. They're hand-me-down stories. So I thought a conversation would be appropriate because maybe there's things like you always wanted to know but never had the opportunity to ask or whatever. And then 2 days before I came, I thought, well, on the other hand, there's this Pete Seeger exhibit here. And that's part of my story too, part of my family's story. And I thought maybe it would be kind of fun on a personal level, intimate level, to share some of our family stories about Pete and how Woody and Pete were so connected through through their lives. So I'm going to do that instead. And if you have any questions, we can have our conversation in the park or some other time, whatever. So I wanted to, I'm just focusing on a project that I did a number of years ago called My Name is New York, which is the title of a song that Woody wrote when he came to New York City in 1940, actually. And so some of what you're going to hear today are excerpts from that project. We did a book of Woody's life in New York, like a guide, a walking tour of his life in New York, and also an audio book tour, which includes excerpts of interviews from so many of the people that lived with Woody, worked with Woody, that luckily we had access to. So that's what this program is going to be about, when Pete met Woody. So when did he meet Woody? Whoop, I gotta go this way. What? Did it go? Oh, okay, I skipped one though, right? Maybe I ought to stand over here. There you go. What this is
The delay.
Rusty. Okay, so what this is, I'm gonna start out as a map. Let me see, get my thingy here. This is Bryant Park, by the way, Times Square, 42nd Street, right here. That's where Woody's sitting, playing his guitar, getting his shoes shined. This photograph is taken from Pete Seeger's backyard on MacDougal Street, where they played early on together. Yeah? There we go. Okay, and this is a map of the subway system of New York City in 1940, what it was like when Woody first came to New York. Again, these are some of the locations that I was able to identify from Woody's lyrics. He most often wrote at the bottom of each lyric the date that he wrote the song, where he wrote the song, so we were able to compile a database of over 3,000 lyrics that he wrote, and just focus on some of these main locations in Manhattan where certain songs were born. Rusty. Am I there? Did I skip?
Sort of.
Okay. Sorry.
This
This is showing one thing. This is showing one thing, and this is showing the other. Could somebody run that for me? You know how to press forward and back?
I can do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Your clicker, your thing.
Okay, I'll just go like this and we'll switch to the next one. But I want to go back to, back one.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, so the reason that Woody came to New York in the first place was because of this man, Will Geer, who Woody was a friend of in California. And Will Geer was an actor. A lot of you might know him later on as Grandpa Walton in The Waltons. He was one of Woody's best friends. He had been hired to come to New York to star in a show called Tobacco Road that was on Broadway. And after he got here, he wrote to Woody and he said, you know, they'd really like your songs here. There's a lot of activity happening in New York, progressive politics in particular. Woody was having a little trouble in LA with some of his music, with sponsors and stuff, not liking his songs on the radio. So he followed Will to New York. This is the apartment building that Will was living in. He was doing quite well as a Broadway star in New York and had a penthouse apartment across the street from the plaza. And Woody came to New York, shacked up on his couch for a week or so. And after the first week, he moved over to Hanover House, which was a kind of a Fleabag hotel. This is on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue. This is the Hanover. Any of you, this is another view. There's a tuxedo shop right there. This is the corner of 43rd Street and 6th Avenue in Manhattan. For those of you who might know the city, Town Hall is right down here, if you've ever been to Town Hall. It's absolutely right next door to Hanover House. So Woody comes to the big city, and the first week he's in Hanover House, he basically is inspired by looking out the window of his flop house. He writes "This land is your land" after living in Hanover House for one day. And he writes it in one day. And my opinion about this song is that it's almost like a journal entry. I don't even know if he knew what he was writing when he was writing it, other than it's exactly step by step the sights and sounds that he hears as he's coming into New York. So it's kind of like, you ever travel and you get to Paris or something, you're like, we're here, and it was really great, and the flight was this, and the trees are green. That's kind of what This Land Is Your Land is, because it's just a week after he's arrived in Manhattan. He writes on the bottom of this, all you can write is what you see. And what we're going to see now is what he saw. First thing he notices is the hats that women are wearing in Manhattan. And they're kind of ridiculous. But it's the fashion. And one of the first songs he writes, the day after he writes This Land Is Your Land, is a song called Women's Hats. Inspired by a quick glance out of my window at an office girl going to work. February 24th, he writes This Land Is Your Land, February 23rd. Isn't it interesting to look at a writer in context? How could you write This Land Is Your Land and then write Women's Hats the next day? But that is typical Woody. Unedited, uncensored, all you can write is what you see. He saw hats, he wrote a song. I had the luck of recording this song with Del McCoury last year. If any of you, I thought this was a great lyric for a bluegrass band, and so I recorded this with Del, and it's called Del and Woody is the album, but this is the second song he wrote at Hanover House. Thanks so much, Rusty. This is so much better than me with this singing. Yeah. So here we are. We've gone from February 23, 24. A couple of days later, Will Geer invites him to perform at a benefit for the agricultural workers, the Steinbeck Committee for Agricultural Workers. It takes place at midnight at the Forest Theater. The Forest Theater is where Will Geer is performing in Tobacco Road. That's how they got access to the theater. So this is March 3rd, the night that Woody first met Alan Lomax, Leadbelly, a number of other people, Aunt Molly Jackson, and finally Pete Seeger. And I'd like you to listen to Pete's description of that night.
It was early March 1940, and there was an evening benefit concert for the California agricultural workers on the stage of a small theater on Broadway. There was a star cast. Burl Ives was on the show, and Josh White, and I mentioned Leadbelly already, and the Golden Gate Quartet. Alan Lomax insisted that I be allowed to sing one song, though the people in charge thought it was silly. I was completely unknown then, and I walked in front of the stage and sang the Ballad of John Hardy very amateurishly, and got a smattering polite applause and retired in confusion. I introduced Woody, whom nobody had ever heard, as one of the that we were raising money for. Because in those days it was mostly Okies and Arkies and Texies that were the pickers of fruit and vegetables in California. And on stage, Woody was very relaxed. He'd tell a joke. You know, Oklahoma is a very dry state. I once saw several telephone poles chasing one little dog. And then he'd sing a song, My Oklahoma Hills Where I Was Born, or something like that.
Act it out.
And then he'd tell another joke. You know, in Oklahoma, we got lots of oil in the ground. You want some oil, go down the hole and get you some. We got lead in the ground. If you get some lead, go down the hole and get you some lead. Coal. Go down the hole, get you some coal. You want food, clothes, or groceries, just go in the hole and stay there. And then sing another song. Well, then Alan says to Woody, says, Woody, I don't know if you realize, but you're like the ballad singers of the old times. Whoever wrote the ballad of Jesse James might have been like you. But he said, you got to come down to Washington, D.C. and let me record you. We have a recording station there. And Alan recorded Woody hour after hour. His life story and all the jokes he could think of. And all the songs, old and new, he could think of, literally recorded hour after hour after hour.
It's a great description of their first night together, how they meet. And I love the idea that Pete Seeger is going off in humiliated confusion because he didn't think he did so good. Woody is totally at home and confident. He had been doing radio work for a number of years. But he was always a very confident performer, and something I think that might get lost in the history a little bit is his performance and his casualness and his easiness of performance. I think he was a natural, actually. That's what they call a natural. He didn't brush up for performance. He didn't rehearse for performance. He could very easily walk on stage and relate to an audience very intuitively and with humor, etc. He was an early entertainer as a child in his little town of Okima, where he talks about doing dancing in front of the curtains before the show. You know, he was an entertainer to a large extent, and I like thinking of him like that. You know, sometimes I watch my brother perform, and they're so similar, the ease and the casualness with which they can relate to an audience, and pick up the audience's vibe, and then give it back to them. Where Pete at that time was much more studied, you know, much more of a studied performer. Of course, he changed, but Woody was very, very casual, very funny. I do like the joke with the posts. Did you all get it? Yeah. Sometimes people in New York don't get jokes because we don't have a lot of posts. I just want to double check. Okay. So here we get, so that's March 3rd. Now we're at March 5th, 2 days later. He's in the same house, he's looking out the window, and he sees a guy walking with long hair and a robe. We call them homeless in Manhattan. Woody thought it was Jesus Christ. He said that's exactly what Jesus Christ would look like if he was walking down the streets of Manhattan in 1940. So he grabs a pen and paper and writes Jesus Christ. It was a very good week for Woody Guthrie. Yeah. He meets Alan Lomax, Leadbelly, Pete Seeger. He writes This Land Is Your Land, Jesus Christ, Women's Hats, which most of you don't know, and gets invited to the Library of Congress. First week there in New York. So let me see if I can, okay. So that's March. I'm going to fast forward to April. 2 weeks later, Woody gets invited to record some of his Dust Bowl ballad songs through meeting Alan Lomax. Alan arranges for him to record some of his Dust Bowl ballads. The studio is in New Jersey. If anybody's from New Jersey here, hats off. It's in Camden, New Jersey. 2 days of recordings. But they asked him to do a song based on John Steinbeck's novel, Grapes of Wrath. The movie had just come out, it was a big hit, and they thought, it was like commission, you know, you're the perfect person to write a song about Grapes of Wrath. So Woody goes to his new friend, Pete Seeger, who has an apartment down on the Lower East Side on 4th Street. If any of you, again, know Manhattan, it's on the Bowery and 4th Street. CBGB's is right around the corner. You get the vibe of where these guys are living. Pete's living with Jerry Oberwager, this guy over here. Let's see if here's Jerry Oberwager, there's Pete. And they've become very involved in doing puppet theater for the Dairy Farm Workers Union up in Vermont, etc. They're already doing political theater. So Woody hears that the guy has a typewriter, and he asks if he could go to his apartment and borrow his typewriter. Let's see what Pete Seeger remembers.
I was staying with a friend on the east side, 6th floor walk up, and Woody said, Pete, you still have a typewriter? And I said, yeah. He says, can I use it for a few hours? Victor wants me to write a song about Grapes of Wrath. I said, have you read the book? He says, no, but I saw the movie. Good movie. Woody came along with me. We walked up the 6 flights. My friend wasn't in, but I had a key. And there was my typewriter on desk. Woody sat right down and started typing. Probably, I don't remember him referring to any pieces of paper, but maybe he had scribbled down some ideas. My friend came in and he said, that's all right, keep typing. I'm going to sleep. And he curled up on his bed and went to sleep. And Woody kept typing away, and he'd think a little bit, kept typing away. He had a half-gallon jug of wine, as I remember. Finally, I got sleepy, and I wasn't being of any help to him, so I went to sleep. In the morning, my friend and I woke up, and there was Woody, sound asleep on the floor, and the Ballad of Tom Joad was finished on the desk there.
Tom Joad got out of the old McAllister pen. There he got his parole. After 4 long years on a man-killing charge, Tom Joad come walking down the road, poor boy. Tom Joad come a-walking.
It's a long ballad, and it's a stroke of genius. There's no other word for it, but it's a work of genius.
For those of you who might not know the lyric, this is a copy of the lyric. He's right, it's a very long song. I think there's like 16 verses. Sometimes that would be a short song for Woody. He's written songs that have 85 verses, 93 verses, and I have a vision. I'm going to do an album and ask one artist to do one song on one CD. 85 verses. You know what I mean? Wouldn't it?
Wow.
And we'll do like a 5 CD set. 5 songs. Woody did record Dust Bowl Ballads, like I was saying. This is the original. It came out in 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. They were one song on each side of a record for some of you who might remember those days. One song, you turn it over, there was another song. They were 78s. And Tom Joad was so long, they had to divide it in half. One half of it is on A, and the other half is on B. So, I'm going to try this. You're ahead of me. Okay. So, I mentioned Alan Lomax did bring Woody down to the Library of Congress. He did those interviews with him. Most of you are pretty familiar with that. But the other thing that happened is that Woody and Pete became close musical partners. Pete was 19-ish, I might be wrong, he might be 20 and a half, something like that. He's about 19 years old. He's working as an intern at the Library of Congress while Alan Lomax is doing these interviews. And they're like, oh, you want to play? Yeah, we'll play together. And Pete found that he could easily accompany Woody on his banjo. Woody was a little bit of an erratic guitar player. He would add beats, he would take away beats, he would add verses, and then leave out verses in different performances. But Pete found that he enjoyed playing along with him. It was very spontaneous. And again, Pete had come from higher education. He was at Harvard. He was a student at Harvard. He was an intellectual. And I think this idea of just like letting your hair down a little bit with Woody, following him along, like where are we going now? Musically, philosophically, and geographically as well. So I think that that was, for a 19-year-old, if you remember what it was like to be 19, it must have been pretty exciting for him to kind of get in that very different groove that Woody was, a man of the road and a man of spontaneity and impulse. So they come back from the Library of Congress together, and they hook up with an artist who has a loft on 21st Street. He does modern sculpture, huge modern sculptures. This is the early days of loft living in Manhattan, when artists were taking over these lofts to live and to work. And this guy, Harold M. Bellin, was a sculptor. He gave Woody a cot in the back of his loft where he could sleep. And Pete followed him, and they spent the next couple of weeks in this modern art loft together. And we can hear a little bit of what they did.
Alan said to Woody and me, he says, you know, I got a pile of songs I think you'd be interested in. My father doesn't want them published in his books because they're protest songs. They're farmers' songs, there's coal miners' songs, there's textile workers' songs, lots of different kinds of songs. And I think you could work this up into a book. And I moved up to New York to work on this book with Woody. I think it only took us 4 or 5 weeks. We figured out a title, hard-hitting songs for hard-hit people. And we figured what would be the first chapter and what would be the second and the third and the fourth chapter. And we just worked 16 hours a day. We had a little time to sleep. And by the end of 5 weeks, we had a book.
I love that story of them working together. While they're living in this loft, by the way, they hold ballad nights, which was a way of it was right before the word hootenanny, like a week before they came up with the word hootenanny. It was called ballad nights. And they would put out flyers and invite friends and family to just come and hang out and play music. So some of the early people were people like Burl Ives. He was also like 21, 22, etc. So it was an interesting crowd. And I was at a Philip Glass concert the other night, actually. And Philip was discussing his roots and his origins, also doing the exact same thing in a loft in downtown Manhattan. 20 of his friends would come and listen to his music and concerts, support him, etc. And I'm always struck by the mirror images of so many of these people's lives. It's almost like the exact same story in some way. So, 50 years later, here's Philip Glass going, and 10 people show up and like it. It's the exact same thing with the ballad singers at the time. It was a very, very small group of friends. Let me try it this way. I'm just going to see what happens. Yeah. In a very short period of time, Woody becomes somewhat popular. With the release of Dust Bowl Ballads, he gets a radio show in New York. He writes to his wife Mary and the kids in California, come on here. I'm making so much money, I have to sleep under it or something like that. He's making a lot of money. He's a sudden radio star. Within a month and a half, he's kind of disgusted with the whole thing. He doesn't like the sponsorship. He doesn't like the control they have over him and what he says and what he writes. He gathers his family up. They go back to California, and he gets work doing the Bonneville Dam songs on there. Pete writes to him. This is June. We're still in the same. You know what I mean? This is all happening kind of fast. He gets a letter from Pete Seeger, and says, "Coming back to New York. There's some interesting things happening with a group I'm forming."
The almanacs had started with Lee Hayes and me. Woody was out writing songs for the Bonneville Power Administration, songs about the Grand Coulee Dam. And I write him, "Woody, we've been singing for Union this year. The striking transport workers had a big rally in Madison Square Garden, and Lee and Mill and I were introduced, and we sang the song and had them all singing with us, including your song, There Once Was a Union Made. And you ought to come east and join us." Hitler invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd. The first words out of Woody's mouth were, "Well, I guess we won't be singing any more peace songs, will we?" I said, "You mean we have to support Churchill?" "Yep. Churchill says, all support to the gallant Soviet allies." I says, "Is this the same Churchill who in 1920 said, 'Strangle the Bolshevik infant in its cradle'?" "Yep, Churchill's flip-flopped. We got to flip-flop." He was right.
So this first group of the Almanac Singers, this little band here, they did a recording, and with the $200 they made from the recording, they bought this car. And it's a blue Buick. The story is they bought it from a mafia guy in Jersey, so it was armor plated and gun protected, but it was big, so they could fit 5 guys and their instruments into the car. So they did their first tour in this 1930-something Buick, armor-plated Buick. And in My Name is New York, and the project I did, I include a lot more interviews from the people of what it was like, these early tours, and et cetera. I don't have time to play them today, but you might be interested in the mafia story, the mafia connection, not the French connection, the Jersey connection. Yeah, but this is an adorable picture. Look at these guys. Woody is all of 29, something like that. Lee Hayes, oh my God, like right out of kindergarten. Millard, hello nerd. Look at that. And Pete hasn't changed. Yeah, one of the first houses they live in, again, this is a very popular story with artists. You've heard, some of you, the jazz series of the jazz lofts that they had in some of the public radio stations a couple of years ago. This was a folk loft. They lived communally, they shared money, they shared songs, they shared all kinds of things. And this particular location is on 10th Street and Greenwich Avenue. If you know Manhattan in the Village, it's a very noticeable, everyone knows that corner on Greenwich Avenue and 10th Street. This was their first, one of their first houses together. They called it Almanac House. And Woody's apartment was up here on the balcony, 2nd floor. And all these other people lived with them. This is Sis Cunningham, Bess Lomax, Cisco Houston, Pete Seeger, Woody, etc. And I just love the spirit of this. I have a 30-year-old son who plays bluegrass in Brooklyn right now. They look exactly like this. It's like unbelievable, the spirit and the whole thing, you know? It's just so loose and so fun. And they're open for bookings. Look at that. They advertise. In other words, some people think that all these left-wing people just want to play for free at boycotts and stuff. No, 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 no. They're getting bookings. They want bookings. The best collection of working people's songs in the USA. That's a big statement, right?
Yeah.
Meetings, rallies, picnics, parties, shows, lectures, union songs, folk ballads, work songs, Beat Hitler songs, the Almanac Singers, 130 West 10th Street, New York City. Telephone, call, get a booking, right? It ends up, they become very well known because of the war effort. They start writing a lot of anti-Hitler songs, which have become very, very popular, singing them on the radio, etc. And they move into another apartment here. This is on 6th Avenue between 9th and 10th Street. If you might know, there was a women's prison across the street from that at the time. And I can only imagine what they thought when they were communing with the women. The women used to yell out the windows like, anybody got any ciggies? You know, I used to walk by there. I went to school right around there. So the women were very, very vocal on the street at that time. But I wanted to have you hear, again, what Pete talks about in terms of their upcoming popularity.
$100 a month. So we got a cheaper place for $60 a month, about a block away, right over a dance hall. Saturday nights we were away singing, but they had dancing going on till after midnight. And we had one big room to live in and one very small room, which Sis Cunningham and her husband lived in. And Mill and Woody and I and Bess all shared the big room, and we had a bathroom. Once Woody found me playing the mandolin while sitting on the toilet. He said, "Now I've seen it all." I remember briefly the Almanacs got on Coast to Coast radio. It was right after Pearl Harbor. A man named Norman Corwin was a leading director for CBS, and he put together a show called This Is War. And it was seen from coast to coast, an hour-long show. And he asked the Almanacs to sing round and round, Hitler's grave, you don't get up no more. And all of a sudden we had one of the leading managers on Broadway sign a contract, and he was going to get lots of jobs. And he invited us to a big hotel where they had a sumptuous spread of food so we could meet prospective clients. And there we were, Woody, Bess Lomax, Sis Cunningham, Arthur Stern, and me. But Woody was outraged by this millionaire surrounding. And he managed to put in the guitar case a whole lot of silver. and anyway, they got us a job at the Rainbow Room up at the top of Rockefeller Center.
They kind of thought that it might be funny for us to do a kind of a country hick act up in the Rainbow Room. And they didn't say anything to us about what we should do, but just go and do our thing. So we went and did our thing. And they were all laughing all the time. They were just hysterical because Woody began putting in verses the Rainbow Room is mighty fine. You can spit from here to the Texas line, and things like that. And that just, you know, people with a lot of money often like to be insulted mildly if it doesn't get too serious. And they thought that was very funny. And they came racing back afterwards, this whole group of very posh ad executives, basically, and said, that's fine now, you get yourself a good sunbonnet and an apron, and you guys go and get the right kinds of clothes so that you really look like country people. And at which point, Woody began to get really steamed. And finally he said, I'm not going to do it. And they looked at him and they said, well, why not? And he said, I'm not going to do it. It makes fun of the people from where I come, and I'm not going to do that. And they said, well, this is a job. You'll make a lot of money here. They're offering us tremendous amounts of money for us. And by then, Pete and the rest of us were getting our acts together too, and we all said we didn't want to do it, and we walked out. And we made up a lot more rude verses on the way down in the elevator.
At the Rainbow Room, the soup's on the boil. They're stirring the salad with a Standard Oil in New York City, New York City.
That was Bess Lomax, by the way, talking, in case you didn't recognize her voice. So that didn't pan out, the Rainbow Room. I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the collaborative aspects of the importance of Pete's relationship with Woody in specific ways. I'm going to focus a little bit on the writing part of it, because we all know Pete as the sing-along king, right? That's when you think of Pete Seeger, you go to Pete Seeger's concerts to sing.
Yes.
That's why you go. So this was an early example of Pete's influence on Woody's writing. There was this is an article from the Reuben James that was from the New York Times, the list of the missing when the Reuben James was sunk. And it lists all the officers' names, the crew, etc. Woody's first version of the sinking of the Reuben James lists almost all of those people, name by name. Names were very, very important to Woody, as you know from the deportee, Tim Hernandez's project of recovering the actual names, saying names. You know Woody's Sacco and Vanzetti. I just want to sing your name. Bartholomew's, Sacco, Vanzetti. All I want to do is repeat your name. So names were very, very important to Woody. You couldn't sing along. That was the problem. So here's the early version, and if you get a chance, you'll see, Howard Daniel, Glenn Jones, Harold Yore, Hartwell here, blah, blah, blah. All these names, you can go down the list, and he's taking names from all of the men that were lost in the thing. At the bottom of the page here, Woody writes a note. This is the poem the Almanacs first wrote about the sinking of the Reuben James. Later, he does put his name up there, and I've spoken to Pete and said Woody wrote most of it. We threw in a line or two, so that's why the song is credited to Woody. But he writes, an hour later or so, or two, we ganged around the poem, the group, and changed into a good singing song with a chorus that you can join in easy. What were their names?
Yeah.
Tell me, what were their names? Oh, you all know it. Come and sing with us. We're going to tear old Hitler down, as Leadbelly says. So you see the kind of influence that Pete is starting to have on Woody. Woody is a wordsmith, and Pete is a sing-along performer, and they're trying to kind of work it out together. Another aspect of Woody's writings, for some of you, one of these quotes, Okima is one of the singingest, square dancingest, drinkingest, yellingest, preachingest, walkingest, talkingest, laughingest, cryingest, shootingest, fist fightingest, bleedingest, gamblingest, gun club, and razor carryingest of our ranch and farm towns, because it blossomed out into one of our first oil boom towns. Who the heck thought of writing like that? Pete will explain.
My father, curiously enough, felt that Woody was putting it on. He says, can talk good English if he wants to. Why does he speak this bad grammar all the time? He felt this often happened to country people when they got to the city. He didn't realize it was Woody's determination not to change. He did not want New York to change his way of singing or thinking of doing. He was a widely read by the time he got to California. So Woody could talk with a college graduate on equal terms, even though he still was determined to speak country English, bad grammar. One evening we visited a sister-in-law of mine who had a good library, and there was a big volume of Rabelais. And I pointed it out to Woody. He says, oh, he's famous for all sorts of dirty stories. And he said, can I borrow this book? And one day he went through a big 2-inch volume, and in the subsequent weeks I could hear his writing had some of the things where he piled on adjective after adjective after adjective, 10 adjectives to one noun.
Okima was one of the singingest, square dancingest, drinkingest, yellingest, preachingest, walkingest, talkingest, laughingest, cryingest, shootingest, fist fightingest, bleedingest, gamblingest, gun club and razor carryingest of our ranch and farm towns.
It's around 16
because it blossomed
there.
out into one of our first oil boom towns.
Yes. And for the scholars in the room, this is the wrong credit. It's from Woody's My Life, different publication actually. But isn't that interesting that he gets it from Rabelais? And why does he get it from Rabelais? Because he heard that Rabelais writes dirty poems. He's interested. And he learns how to write after that. Anyway, it's a kind of a funny thing. And I love the fact that Pete, as historian, he looked at Pete as a writer influence, but here's Pete as a historian telling us something that not a lot of people know. And it's just from his memories of how a lot of these things happened. So we got Pete as a writing influence, Pete as a historian, primary source, I was there. Let's see what else we got here. Again, as historian and advocate, when Woody came back from the war, it was very clear to him that the fascism that they had been fighting in Europe existed in the United States as well, through racism and Jim Crow, etc. And Woody became a real activist for civil rights. Not so much before that, but after the war. Now he's only in his 30s now. He's kind of working it out like all of us do as we go through life. And I thought this was an interesting bit of history. Again, Pete's memory as historian. This is Woody with Brownie McGee, Sonny Terry, and Lead Belly, Sonny and Brownie too, and of course Woody's famous notation from the war. They had this on exhibit in a museum in England just recently. They loaned it from the center here, and a young guy called me up because this Machine Kills Fascists has taken on a life of its own, so to speak. And the young guy called me and he says, boy, it has such meaning and everyone knows this phrase, this machine kills fascists. Can you give me a background story on it? Like why? Why fascists? And I'm like, hello, have you heard of World War II? This machine kills fascists during World War II. He goes, oh my God, I never thought of that. Okay, but this is why it's important to keep telling these stories.
Yeah.
Here's Pete.
When Woody went out to California, he once sang an old comic song out of the minstrel show days with this phony dialect, D's and dem, I come to D River, and instead of coming to the river. And he got a letter from a well-educated black man saying, dear Mr. Guthrie, I think you mean well, or I would not bother writing you. But did you know that song you sang today, and he quoted it, is really offensive to a lot of people like me. And in a few sentences told him what it's like to be out of slavery but still be treated like a second-class citizen. And Woody read the man's whole letter on the air the following day. Said, well, folks, you heard the song I sung, I guess, and you heard, I just read you his letter. Now I want you to listen. I'm holding his letter right up near the mic, and he tears it. Now, you know how paper can sound quite loud when you tear it. And he had that paper 1 inch from the microphone as he tried. I'm not going to sing that song again. Woody and Brownie and Sonny were hired to sing for a big war bond drive. Buy war bonds, beat Hitler. And they were singing, getting the whole crowd singing, we're going to tear Hitler down, we're going to tear Hitler down. And after they sang and got a lot of applause, the chairman of the evening said, Mr. Guthrie, we have a seat for you on the table for the rest of dinner. And we have a table for your friends in the kitchen. Woody said, what do you mean? We're here to sing together, can't we eat together? And the man said, well, Mr. Guthrie, this is Baltimore, remember? And Woody said, this fight against fascism got to start right here. And he picks the whole big table, like 7 feet in diameter, picks up, and all the glasses and silverware crashed to the floor. Finally, he picks this one up, crash! And now they grab him by both arms and hustle him out. And Sonny's saying, Woody, you're going to get us in trouble. I'm lame and Sonny's blind. Woody kept shouting, this fight against fascism got to start right here.
It's a powerful story, isn't it? One of the things I also like from these personal recollections is that Woody was not a pacifist. He was a scrapper. He learned boxing from his father in the early days in Okima. He picked up guns when he had to. He picked up his fist when he had to. Psychologically, he was a different character than Pete. And sometimes when you think of the folk music movement, it's a little gentler. It's more of a gentle story, gentle giants with sit-downs and a lot of that stuff. And as much as my father certainly participated in that, he was a little bit more of a warrior, I would say, spiritually. He was a little bit more of a warrior. He wasn't afraid of getting into an actual fight, or Pete telling how he picks up the table and he throws the glasses. He can destroy fascism in his way, with song, but also with fist. And I think that these are, interesting character things that I try to point out, just to give a little bit more insight. And maybe you're a warrior too. It's okay. Go here. Okay. I have to go back just one. Skip one. Okay, so we're kind of up to the 1950s. I'm skipping along here, but Pete started a group in the 1949, I think it was exactly, called the Weavers, which was the remnants of the people in Almanac Singers. After the war, they gathered together and they started this group called the Weavers, which is probably the first popular folk music #1 hit group in the United States, or maybe even in the world. Some of the scholars here, sometimes I'll say things, I don't know if they're true, but I feel like it's true. Trump said that, didn't he? I remember Kellyanne Conway said that. It might not be true, but he feels it's true. We can feel our truth too. So that they recorded a song called Saina Saina, an odd little song from Israel that became #1 hit on the Billboard charts. And the second album they made included So Long It's Been Good to Know You. Pete was an advocate of Woody's every single day, all along. It was Pete's idea and Lee's idea to record So Long. They stuck by Woody every single day. Woody at this point is not performing with them. As a matter of fact, he's not performing too much these days. He's starting to show symptoms of Huntington's disease. We don't know it's Huntington's disease. They say he's alcoholic. They say he's hard to work with. They say he's erratic in his behavior. He leaves home, he doesn't come home. All kinds of things are happening, and some kind of deterioration, which everyone is attributed to alcoholism at the time. It turns out it wasn't. It was the early symptoms of Huntington's disease. So he kind of has to separate himself from the core of the folk music world at that time. The stable people go on and create the Weavers and create hits from that thing. The irony of the whole thing, let's see if that works, is because of the popularity of So Long It's Been Good to Know You, our little family, which has been living in a one-bedroom little studio tenement apartment in the basement in Coney Island, suddenly we have some money, and my parents move us over to this apartment in Beach Haven with the royalties from So Long It's Been Good to Know You. We're able to afford this rent, which was about $120 a month. The irony of this location, and here's my dad, this is the three of us. Arlo's having a little trouble there. You have to sign, when you leave here, sign you will never mention Arlo. What do they call it, confidentiality? I show these things at my own risk, knowing that no one will ever tell Arlo. Yet, evidently he played with dolls. This is me. This is my brother Jody. I have to mention, because we talked about the seats here, Jody's, my other brother's seats. His name is Jody, Jody. He's named after Tom Joad. His middle name is Ben, which in Jewish means son of. So he is the declared son of Guthrie. Tom Joad, son of Woody Guthrie.
Hey.
It's pretty heavy. And he's born on December 25th. So everyone says, what does your other brother do? Arlo's here and you're there, and I go, he sits like this. I say, honey, just hold the names. Just hold the names. That's all you have to do. Don't do anything. Just sit there. Hold the name. Okay. So meanwhile, I have to work my ass off. The other irony about this is Beach Haven apartment, and Will Kaufman just discovered and wrote quite a lot about. This was owned and operated by Fred Trump. And we actually have the lease that my father signed with the Trump organization to move into this apartment. My father also wrote and recorded a number of songs about Fred Trump. If you just Google Woody Guthrie and Trump, and Will Kaufman's information will come up all over the place. And we found one of my favorite titles is Trump Made a Tramp Out of Me. Took all my money, made a tramp out of me. The apartments were segregated, which my dad didn't know when we moved in, so a lot of his writings have to do with Trump's racial segregation policy with his apartments, etc. That's a whole other program. Okay. A little bit more, Pete and Woody are together. This is in Lenox, Massachusetts at the Music Inn. When it first opened in 1950, they did a small concert there together. I think we have pictures of the concert, about 25 people in the audience, but it's kind of one of the last photo essays I have of them working together when my father's not too bad off here. And it's just a lovely, action-packed. One of the things I love about Pete is he's always watching. You see in every photo when he's playing with someone else, he's always watching Leadbelly, Woody, whoever he's playing with, this directness in his eyes, like he's taking it all in. Look at that focus on his face. You know, I think it's just very beautiful. It's like a beautiful portrait. Woody is about 7 or 8 years older than Pete. And Pete really looked up to him as a big brother in a lot of ways, musically, philosophically, politically, etc. So this is one of the last photos that we have of them actually playing together. But of course the story goes on. When my father was sick for about 15 years with Huntington's, he was hospitalized, but on Sundays we would bring him home. And a lot of his friends would come for hootenannies. By that time they had invented the word hootenanny. So this is our house in Queens, in Howard Beach, Queens, New York. And just a little portrait of some of the people that would come out on Sundays to play music together. I'm the youngest child of all of these people. I would just make 2 points, because people ask me, do I play guitar? And I emphatically say no, because all these other people did. And they're all older than me, and they're all guys. You get it? Like you're a little girl, and all these guys, They're endlessly tuning guitars, which I have nightmares about. And like, when you sit in a folk circle, you get into it. It's like a mantra. Everyone's getting high on tuning, but if you have to sit there and listen, it's like water dropping. So, I didn't want to have anything to do with the guitar. I start on time and I don't play guitar. Those are my two. But here's some just wonderful, portrait of some of the close friends like Pete and Sonny Terry Brown McGee that came out. Ramblin' Jack Elliott. It came out. He actually became my babysitter for a year and a half. My mother was a dancer with Martha Graham's company. She was the one that was on tour most of the time, to be honest. And my dad was left home with us, watching 3 babies. We're a year apart, 1, 2, and 3.5 years old. A lot of diapers, a lot of bottles. And so I once ran into Jack a couple of years ago. I said, "How did you guys handle it?" It's like Woody and Jack home taking care of 3 little kids. How did you guys do it? He goes, "We put rum in your bottle." Bob came to the house in 1961, and then following Bob, a lot of his friends, once he recorded Song to Woody, etc., started coming. Phil Oakes, New Lost City Ramblers, just about everybody on the block that you can think of. Some made it, some didn't, some you know of, some you don't know of. But it was quite a time with growing up with these people around me all the time. I actually slammed the door on Bob when he first came. I was watching American Bandstand, and I was learning the locomotion. Remember how they used to do that? They would teach you. I'm doing this, and doorbell rings, and like, oh shit. I'm 11 years old, and I open the door, and there's a guy standing there with a guitar. "Is Woody Guthrie here?" I'm like, "Nope." Ran back to American Bandstand, learning locomotion. The guy is persistent, I have to tell you. He knocks on the door again. We have a babysitter who's from the Catholic school nearby, parochial, with the knee socks and the pleated skirt and the little blazer. And I go, "You get it." We go to the door again. "I was told Woody Guthrie's here and I wanted to come and say hi." Like, "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Guthrie isn't home and we don't allow strangers in the house," and blah, blah, blah. Close the door, go back. He rings again. This is how you make it. And you just keep knocking no matter what. Didn't he write a song, "Knockin' on Heaven's Door"? Third knock, Arlo comes down. He's about 14 at the time. He's already playing guitar. And he's just like, "Oh, you got a guitar? Hey, man." That's the way we talk then. "Hey, man, I think I play guitar. Come on in. You want to play?" "Yeah, hey, man." Well, yeah, that's all they said to each other. And then they sat and played until my mother got home from work. And so I always laugh like, "Oh my God, history would have been so different if it was up to me." Totally screwed it up. None of this would be here. No museum, no center, no green, no Bob, no Pete, nothing. Yeah. So I've been making it up ever since. Trying to make up for it here. Of course, this is a beautiful obituary. Pete was the one who wrote the obituary when my dad died. They had a tribute concert to him at Carnegie Hall in 1968. Dylan had just come out of retirement after his motorcycle accident, and he appeared with his backup band, which became the house band, which became the band. It's all the same guys. They're all in their 20s basically. And it was the first time, I like this because it's the first concert that Pete and Arlo ever played together. Like, forget about Bob for a second. Well, of course, there's Judy Collins. But first of all, he's so cute. He's such a nice little Jewish boy. Don't you think? I always imagine him with payas. He's got that look, right? He's got a payas look. And Pete and Arlo, that's their first concert together in 1968 at Carnegie Hall. 18, 19, 20. Arlo's 20 years old at the time. And I just wanted to say in a nutshell, their relationship continued for the next 50 years until Pete passed away, actually. They played together in all kinds of events, at Carnegie Hall together many times, at Clearwater many times, around the world many times. And Pete has been kind of, I don't want to say surrogate father, but he's been a grand man in our life, all of our life. And you know, the thing with Pete is like you could never live up to him. Never. And I like my father because you could always live down to him. We could all drink, you know, smoke, you know, fool around with women, whatever, like that I could relate to. Yeah, Pete was like, woo! St. Pete! Woo! Anyway, but they found a nice way of, again, like Woody and Pete used to say, when Woody was gone, I can't stand him when I'm with him, but I miss him when he's gone. There was that kind of dynamic together. And Arlo and Pete remain very, very close musically and professionally all these years. If it wasn't for Pete, we wouldn't be here. Pete was the one who brought This Land Is Your Land to every child in America and beyond throughout the 1950s. He sang it at every concert, among other of my father's songs, but I would say he single-handedly made this song as whatever it's become to you. It's because of Pete, and this is the first publication of the song sheet. And I have proof of what I'm saying because Pete said, all I know is if I'm singing This Land Is Your Land every day, I'm doing my job. And that's all I have to say.